Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. In today's internal staff webinar, we have Joshua Tan joining us as a guest speaker. I think currently connected from London, joining us from London. He will present Public AI, of which he is the founder of, if not one of the founders. Joshua, he will tell us later about it. But before that, a brief introduction. So I could mention that in the previous webinars, took place in July, we covered the pre-training of Apertus and then the release plan, at least of the version 1.0, which has been worked on so far. Release that, as we know, took place at the beginning of September. And as we also know, in particular from the last QPM and the recent town hall, our engineering attention now moves also in the area of serving models such as Apertus to enable various downstream applications for our users. And this is partially why, along with the model release in September, we at CSCS decided to donate some computational resources to Public AI cause to make our contribution to the public serving of Apertus, especially at the launch. And we are one of the contributors of compute resources to Public AI. Briefly, maybe what I know about Public AI is that we operate, so rather, Public AI operates the user interface, this chat-centric websites and the gateway to handle and route requests, and CSCS, as well as other contributors, dedicate computational power, in our case, a few dedicated Alps nodes, receiving requests from their services. And well, also looking at the data for October, in particular for the past 3 weeks, we see that at about 1 or 2 months, depending on how you look at it, distance from the launch, there are at the moment 2.5 million tokens served per week from our nodes of Alps to the Public AI services. But just to give you a sense of the load that we're talking about. Yet, just as a reminder, these numbers are just what we see coming to the Alps nodes. Again, there are other contributors. But again, today's presentation by Joshua will be, as we saw from the abstract, less about the technological aspects, and he will rather illustrate the initiative that he is leading, and with that, it'll help us discover more, again, out of the mere technological aspects of what's happening around the world when it comes to deploying and serving AI models to the public and what this entails. So with that, I would conclude my introduction and leave it to you, Joshua. So nice that you are with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Stefano, and Just, and everybody here in CSCS. Actually, I'll just mention, yes. So the original version of this presentation that Stefano saw and that I'm going to share now was actually originally presented to TPC, the Trillium Parameter Consortium, and that was kind of like a more policy angle. So what you'll see here is a bit more policy flavored. But if you do have any questions on the technical specifications, token throughput, latency, things like that, hyperparameters, our lead engineer, Joseph Lowe, is in the room. And I don't know if there's a way for you to ask questions, but he's also very happy to answer it, take any questions. So thanks for being here, Joseph, on Singapore time currently. Okay, let's just jump in then. What is Public AI? So we can start with a very basic question here. Do you trust the US or China to respect your culture, keep your state secrets, and give you fair trade deals? So I can't see people's faces here, but generally speaking, when I give this talk anywhere in Europe, the UK, Canada, Japan, almost nobody says yes. But even if you're American or you're Chinese, do you really trust, and you're a startup, let's say, do you really trust OpenAI to maintain their current API prices, or to not build an in-house alternative to whatever product you might be building? And almost every startup I've ever talked to says no, they don't trust OpenAI. But the reality of the world we live in today, what these startups and all of us live in, is not that great, to be honest. Around 80% of the global consumer chatbot market belongs to ChatGPT, the leading sovereign competitor, Mistral's Lechat. That only has, less than 4% in France. And I'm being very generous here because in reality, this is almost certainly 1%. So the leading sovereign AI competitor has 1% adoption in its own home market. And I don't know about you guys, to me, that's a little bit pathetic. There's this narrative out there, which is very much prevalent in San Francisco, in London, in Brussels, I imagine in Zurich as well, that only a few people can possibly, a few people here, a few very, very large tech companies can possibly build frontier AI. Personally, I think that's a myth, and I think it's a dangerous myth. And that's why we started talking about public AI. It's this idea that AI can and should be a form of public infrastructure like highways, libraries, electricity, water, or the internet itself. So public AI, really, first of all, is a kind of idea. We talk about accessibility, accountability to the public, being permanently public. It's something you can depend on, be stable, and stable price. And there are many, many places you can find out more about this. I think to count, there are over 5 different white papers at this point coming from different countries, speaking to different parts of the movement and different emphases. But public AI, as I just mentioned, is also a movement of many, many different people and institutions. There's folks you may be familiar with, the Internet Archive, Creative Commons, Aspen, Chatham House. Many different universities are involved. Also many companies and many national labs, including obviously folks from Swiss AI, the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, AI Sweden, Mila in Quebec, and others who are contributing and believe in this idea and want to make it happen. Lest I give you the wrong impression, it's not just a bunch of logos. It is actually also real people out there doing things, having meetings, having fun. Of course, there are supercomputers involved. I imagine you guys, of all people, would know which particular supercomputer that one is on the top right.
Barcelona, Marinestrum.
Exactly. So we had a bunch of meetings with BSC. But we also do yoga and have fun. Anyways, this is a hint in the future that if you want to come and hang out with us, there are people, and it's a lot of fun, actually. But public AI is also real today. And I think of my many audiences, you all probably know this very, very well because you're literally running it in your servers. But also you can have it on your phone. You can download an app and start talking with Apertus today. Or you can do that starting literally last month, right? But besides Apertus, I should also mention there are many other models, public AI models built by public model builders, including Salamandra from BSC, GPT-SW3 from AI Sweden, and a family of models used to be called Brit-LLM, now called UK-LLM, built by UCL and Bangor, and many others besides that. Okay, a little bit about me. So I'm Josh, right? I'm a computer scientist and mathematician. Technically, I'm actually a category theorist. I imagine there are not that many category theorists in the room, but it's a fun little side fact. It's what I actually do, technically. I advocate for public AI. I founded and lead research at this research lab called MetaGov. And lastly, I used to do, or still kind of do, machine learning and institutional economics at a few different institutions. And there's a lot of people behind this work that I'll briefly share, including folks from really around the world. Joseph is here joining us from Singapore. We have Alex from the UK, Catherine from the US, Nick from Canada, Robin, who's based in Brussels, Australia, Japan, Canada again, Spain, and many different places who are contributing to many of these projects around public AI. Okay, let's actually jump into some of the specific projects and what's actually happening within this, let's say, broader movement. So in this case, let's first jump into the public AI inference utility. So this is the platform that's actually serving a purchase right now. It's what we call public AI for countries, which is a little bit of me trolling OpenAI, if you're familiar with OpenAI for countries, which is, let's just say, a slightly different set of proposals. Okay, so what's the problem? Right now, deploying open source models is actually pretty hard. Just in the sense that 99% of people didn't deploy their own intranet TCP/IP servers. Most people won't go out of their way to deploy their own models. So just putting it on Hugging Face means a lot of people aren't getting access to it. And the reality is a lot of national labs, in this case, Swiss AI, Zurich, EPFL, they're not really set up to offer kind of this 24-hour end user service, nor are they really set up, and they're kind of especially not set up to kind of generate demand and adoption for these models once they're released. But the reality is, if you don't deploy, you stall, because deployment means users, it means data and use cases, which ultimately gives you the kind of intelligence necessary to make choices about, oh, I need to improve the models on this, on these particular use cases. I need to get data for these things, which ultimately lead to better models and more people using them. So the solution and what we built is the public AI inference utility. It's the world's first public inference stack. The short version of talking about this is it's attempting to be a full service launch partner for public and sovereign AI models. It's free for users. It's also actually free for developers, but if you want a more stable connection, we basically ask for a $1 donation. It's currently launched with Switzerland and Singapore. Soon it will be coming out with models from Spain, at the UK, and Germany. And there are inference partners across 6 different countries, obviously, including CSCS, and growing. Underneath the hood, what this really is in many ways also a policy play. This is us trying to create a proof of concept for what public AI and this idea of an AI public utility could actually be, that kind of offers AI as a kind of public service for an entire country. Now, okay, a little bit about the Apertus launch. I think many of you saw it from your side as well, but obviously you can see what the chat interface looks like. It's based on OpenWeb UI. Magic thing, the utility actually worked. If you know the underlying story behind how fast this had to happen, you might actually be a little bit surprised that we managed to pull it off. But effectively, Imanol, who's one of the co-leads of Apertus, basically reached out a couple of months before the launch and said, "Hey, we're working with Swisscom, but we would appreciate an international fulfillment partner." And we managed to get it together to, support the Swiss AI initiative. And now, effectively, I don't have perfect visibility into what Swisscom's hosting looks like, but I believe that right now the inference utility is actually the main way interface for most people to test and try and use Apertus. During the launch, we also found a bunch of allies in the open source community, which was incredibly helpful. In fact, the CTO of Hugging Face somehow learned about this and said, "We want you guys to be an official Hugging Face partner." And now if you go onto Apertus on Hugging Face today, you can actually go to the right and immediately test it directly in their platform. which is pretty great. And to be quite clear, does not happen for every and most open source models that are released on Hugging Face. And kind of, I suppose the main point is that Apertus itself actually really worked. It is now, I think, the leading sovereign model in the world, and honestly, likely the leading European model in its class, 8B and 70B. You can see how it got to number 6 on Hugging Face for a while. Okay, a few takeaways from my side. One, infrastructure is the new multilateralism. What do I mean by that? I think, even though obviously Apertus was very much a Swiss creation, in order to deploy it through the inference utility, and what's actually backing it right now is really compute from 6 different, actually update that number, 6 different countries at this point. Softly Switzerland, including a huge amount of help from AWS, which is located in Zurich, but also the National Computational Infrastructure of Australia, AI Singapore's supercomputing sort of resources, Jülich in Germany, Exascale, which is a Swiss/Austrian neocloud company, as well as CUDA, which is based in the UK/Norway. But there are also lots of different models which are on the public AI inference utility or coming up soon. And I think my point here is that it really kind of takes an entire world to see a release and get it out there successfully. The second takeaway for me, at least, is that we really still have a huge amount of work still needs to be done. To be quite frank, we are not competitive with ChatGPT. You can see that in our adoption and growth numbers. And now, of course, the first thing that Imanol or Martin might say to a Swiss journalist is that this isn't trying to be ChatGPT, right? But at the same time, if we want it to be used, we need to keep making it better. We need to figure out ways for it to become more competitive. Otherwise, we put it out there, but most people in Switzerland still aren't using it, even though it's the Swiss model. So how can we build a flywheel to keep improving the model, improving the tooling infrastructure, and improving the distribution? I'll talk about different approaches we've been thinking about in the sort of public AI movement around how to tackle some of these problems. In particular, better weights, better tools, and better distribution. And by the way, if you're not clear on what the diagram is saying, it's just articulating the idea that when you use something like ChatGPT, part of the value comes from the weights, so the pre and post training, maybe a little bit of other stuff there, and a lot of the value actually comes from the tools that sit on top of it. So these are things like web search, memory, maybe RAG systems. These are actually incredibly important to how useful a given chatbot or AI system actually is to an end user. Okay, so let's talk about Airbus for AI. And how am I doing on time? I have 30 roughly minutes, right? Okay, good. Okay, I might have to speed through the rest of these slides because I'm only halfway. So Airbus for AI, or how to build the next frontier lab for the rest of the world. So right now, the US and China are the undisputed leaders in AI. Where is everybody else? This is what the internet currently thinks. And usually when I give this presentation, there's some chuckles in the air. I tend to think if you're in Europe, and I'm currently located in Europe, we should be pretty freaking angry about this, right? Because this is effectively what people in San Francisco think about what's happening on the continent right now. And I don't think it's actually true. So let's do a little policy scan. Right now, there is actually a huge amount of public AI happening across the EU and different middle powers, places that aren't the US or China. So I mentioned Sweden and GPT SW3 recently, the EU spending hundreds of billions of dollars on various AI efforts across the factories, gigafactories, Invest AI, Apply AI proposals, and these various different training efforts. Canada with 2 billion, I think that's actually not quite doubled, but it's there's a lot of investment in Canada. Spain with BSC, Singapore pursuing a kind of interesting regional strategy across different parts, trying to bring together Southeast Asia around their set of models. France, a bit of an interesting case as well, with a very, very clear private national champion, Mistral, which, as we thought, has some problems, but also is making money because they actually have a pretty large enterprise operation. The UK, with a set of different initiatives and a new sovereign AI center coming out with about $500 million, and a lot of efforts coming out of Japan as well. Now, all of these countries, though, face what we call the middle powers dilemma, which is, in some sense, just saying there's not enough data or compute, not enough people, not enough risk capital, so venture capital especially, and not a total addressable market to support what we think of as like a very large and classical frontier AI lab. This leads to fragmentation across a bunch of different countries. There's a lot of different regulatory barriers across these different countries. Ultimately, the institutions, the national labs, which are tasked with implementing these sovereign AI strategies, are typically researchers. They're not product people. They aren't set up to take the kind of risks or to access the kind of capital that you need to compete in these spaces. And even if you manage to get, let's say, a leading startup in your country, the reality is a huge amount of capital lives in the US and in China, and they will often just buy you out. And this is exactly what happened with Finland's Silo and with the UK's DeepMind. So when I talk about this, by the way, I'm really specifically talking about the issue of training a very, very large model and training a model family every year, right? It's just a very expensive proposition. How do we do that? And obviously, even with Swiss AI, I think it was incredible what Apertus managed to accomplish, but Apertus is still a 70B model, right? It's not a 700B model. And that takes just an order of magnitude more resources. So when I look at this, to me, this is fundamentally a coordination problem. And 1,000 years ago in AI, i.e. 2 years ago, Yoshua Benjo and I were talking about this idea of a network of publicly funded AI labs. And my point to Yoshua was that this is never going to happen. And can you imagine a bunch of governments just giving money forever to fund and generate these big AI models? The reality is you need some sort of product strategy that actually delivers value to the funding public. And you see sort of Benjo agreeing with me there. About a year later, we started talking to Mateo Valero, who's obviously the director of the Barcelona Supercomputing Center. And he suggested, hey, maybe you guys should look at this thing called Airbus. And we thought that was a great idea. So I don't know how much you guys know about Airbus, but Airbus was originally, it was formed in the 1960s out of these 4 European aerospace firms. So there was Aerospatiale in France, CASA in Spain, DASA in Germany, and Bombardier in the UK. And none of them could really compete with the market dominant at the time, which was Boeing, which also, by the way, had around 80% of the market. So they banded together to form the first Airbus consortium. And there was a few things that made this possible. First, the secret history of how this happened is actually not because this didn't happen because those companies really wanted to come together. They were individually making money, sort of like the way that Mistral, Cohere make money right now. They're profitable. What really happened is the French president and the German chancellor came together and decided, hey, airplanes, they're kind of important. We just fought a war in which they played a very, very, very big role, and maybe Europe should have its own option when it comes to airplanes. So they kind of prodded these companies together and gave a huge amount of government support in the form of direct loans as well as indirect subsidies, a lot of research collaborations, testing sites, launch sites, things like that. From the beginning, Airbus always had a strict product focus. So it was in many ways protected from the local politics within every given country, which is very prevalent in a lot of EU efforts right now. And finally, eventually, over time, these member firms specialized their supply chains into what you see in the diagram today for the A320. And Airbus today is really a success story. It's the largest aerospace manufacturer in the world. And this has been true even before doors started popping out of Boeing's, right? And the question is pretty simple. Well, can we do the same thing for AI? So this Airbus for AI proposal is this idea of how do we organize a set of national laboratories and national champions, so these sovereign AI initiatives, into an Airbus-style consortium that brings these models to market. So it's operating in the market. It is, a company trying to make money and satisfy a set of users in the market. The consortium will focus on the most expensive part of the stack. So doing this model pre-training, competing at a capabilities level, but also doing these go-to-market and working with a set of national entities in every country to figure out things like market access, deployment, and localization. Why did we start thinking about this? In reality, it's partly because we have been working with folks like Swiss AI, with AI Sweden, with BSC for a long time, and realized they really had all these different problems as they were thinking about, okay, what is their tech transfer strategy for the models that they're building? And we kind of realized they all had the same problems around scale, risk profile, not really having a product strategy, not really having a go-to-market. But we also quickly realized that there were a huge amount of public compute investments coming down the line, and this was really important to figure out how do we actually get public value from these additional public compute investments. We ultimately ended up bootstrapping fast, as you saw with the inference utility, and the goal, of course, eventually is for this to become a kind of public infrastructure for startups and local companies as a kind of regulated public utility. I mentioned that before in the inference utility slides. This is just a quick summary of where you're, if you're a smaller country, where do you actually get access to frontier AI? Is it competitive? Does it generate public value? Does it protect sovereignty? Kind of just summarizing, but the options are not necessarily that great. Okay, that's it for the Airbus for AI. Let me talk now about some of the other features that we're building right now, more on the kind of in a technical way, on top of the inference utility. In particular, this idea of public AI plus. How am I doing? Okay, slowly getting there. Wait, just really quickly, we're trying to do 30 minutes presentations, 30 minutes questions, roughly?
Yeah, you should, but you have some flexibility. Just, okay. It's nice and interesting.
Okay, in that case, I'll just run through this really quickly. I gave an earlier, the last part of the presentation around Airbus was this question of how do we build competitive weights? And the second part of the question that we were really starting to try to understand is how do we build a competitive pooling infrastructure for public AI? And we fundamentally believe that tools are kind of the future of the internet. That right now, every website is slowly or quickly becoming a kind of tool, whether through web search or through some sort of native tooling that gets built on top of it. But the issue is that even though there are technically lots of tools and lots of MCP servers, there's no curation for any of these things. And even though there are a lot of interfaces for tools, any chatbot is technically an interface for a set of tools, right? But also there's Hugging Face Spaces. There's no really good way of collaborating on these tools. So we thought, hey, is there a peer production strategy here that we can take? And the idea here would be something like, if you look at AI services today, things like OpenAI or Claude, they really are kind of monolithic. They look like a group of people, this 100 wizards sitting in a very, very large and fancy office, building and making decisions about what the service looks like. It's very centralized, it's closed, it's commercial. It's in some ways like the original Encyclopedia Britannica or Microsoft's Encarta. What we are hoping, and very much I want to be clear, this is a very active effort that Joseph has been leading and we've been thinking about for quite a while, is how do we build this kind of Wikipedia for AI, or really for AI tools? How do we build a hub for distributing and curating peer-produced tools? One way of thinking about this is a kind of Wikipedia-style knowledge graph of tools, where every page Every tool is kind of like a page that manages a kind of core functionality, whether it's like something about a dog or the weather or a simple calculator. The big open question for us, though, is how do we actually build the smallest contribution cycle? Think about it like in Wikipedia. It's very easy to edit a page and that immediately shows up for everybody else. How do we build that kind of contribution cycle to make it really, really easy for people to contribute to these kinds of tools? I'm going to skip these, how it works, and I'll just say that right now, the way this actually we've started prototyping this is just taking OpenWeb UI and giving not huge amounts of people, but a small group of people, and increasing just a lot of extra permissions, so they can deploy their own tools and manage, in some sense, a bunch of their own models. This is something that obviously folks like OpenAI or Anthropic would never do, but it's something I think we feel comfortable taking a risk on, because we think we need to somehow be more open to different contributions from across the world, and this is our hope, one way of doing it. Okay, last quick call, and this is kind of like a larger call to action around what is the follow-up to the Apertus launch? How do we continue to drive adoption to it? And some of our initial conversations around this idea of a Swiss inference utility. So as I mentioned earlier, deploying open source models is hard, and specifically driving adoption is a huge issue. How do we, even assuming you have a competitive product and you've solved all the problems around tooling and the sort of the value and the weights, how do you get people to actually use it? What is your go-to-market effectively? The reality is the entities who are best in the world at this, best suited for this kind of work, are commercial entities of some sort. Also, let's face it, the reality, hosting inference isn't free. Right now, the inference utility basically takes a bunch of donated compute and uses it to support these kind of national AI initiatives. But there's an open question: is like, how do we actually make sure this is sustainable in the long term? And to be clear, there are a variety of answers to that, including just funding it through public inference, and we're exploring different options. But the option we're exploring here in Switzerland is, what if we try to build a nationwide cooperative? What would this cooperative do? It would aggregate demand for Apertus. It would work to actually bootstrap and increase demand for Apertus, working with doing developer relations, working with local businesses. It would maintain a kind of local tooling stack. And I'm particularly excited about this. I'll have a slide later about what this means for Swiss users and companies. It would work with local inference providers, not just CSCS, but also what I think of as like, local ISPs that, have some GPUs and trying to offer a service, charging for tokens. It could potentially raise private capital, which, we can't do because we're a nonprofit. And ultimately, it would be a Swiss entity that would govern the model and the deployment of it in a way that I think responds to this call for national sovereignty that's driving a lot of these conversations. Okay, one particular emphasis here I'll make here is that in the original sort of slide here, I talked a little bit about, so there's a little box on the top around native tool integrations. What do I mean by that? What I really think about here is like, oh, what if you could go to your AI and just ask it to renew your driver's license or book an appointment with your local hospital? These are really local kinds of tools, integrations that, OpenAI is never going to really care about or do. But I think, especially as we take a more local approach, we can start to imagine, hey, this is possible. We can build more local tooling that really increases the value and the quality of responses to local queries, which I think could be a kind of superpower for these local kind of public utility style plays. I'll just mention, the problem is actually pretty important. This is our daily active sort of user count, but the reality is we burn through quite a bit of money every week in compute, right? raised around $10,000 worth of compute for purchase for its launch. And due to a lot of optimizations, thanks to Joseph, we've managed to stretch out how far we think we can host a purchase. Originally, it was going to be until the end of November, now maybe the end of December. And we think at the very least, we can host the APU models all the way to May. By the end of the day, or possibly indefinitely, depending on where our inference providers stand. But the reality is, at some point, we need to figure out how do we generate some sort of sustainable income stream to support this. And there's a kind of a roadmap to this. I'll just say we've been working with some people from Swiss AI Weeks to raise grant funding, perhaps organize a joint application to ventures.ch, and working on different sides of the technical roadmap around advertising, around the platform, around local data to try to make this work happen. You can see it all. It's all public on GitHub. It's all open source. There's some open questions we can sort of have in the discussion around what should be the business strategy for this. How should we drive adoption for purchase, and more generally a Swiss AI stack across Switzerland itself. Basically the ask is like, please get involved. This is very much a public open movement, an open source set of open source projects really. And we really benefit from bringing more people on board. Okay, with that, I'm going to skip this last slide around the political narrative, but it's just saying that there's a lot going on here. And part of the idea here is that we want to communicate not just to businesses and different supporters, but to governments, local and national, around how important AI is, how important it is to support more inference, more development along these lines, to try to drive this conversation forward. Okay, with that, thank you very much, Josh, and this is Public AI.
Thank you, Joshua, for this amazing presentation, for this overview. We now have some time for questions. I would give it a moment to see if any comes from the audience. Okay, if not, I could try to break the ice. For example, I recall earlier on your presentation this analogy with the power that we get from the wall socket or the water that comes out of the tap. And just to double click on that, my question is like the tensions between the different parties in the public sector, especially at cross-national level. That's something we see quite often at CSCS in this multinational project, especially at the European level, where achieving consensus is quite slow, and I think it impacts activity when, of course, you consider, as also you said, that in AI, slow means kind of irrelevant, right? Something arrives late. And the second aspect in this is that the end users tend to be not too loyal, and until things are affordable, the vast majority just flocks where the better model is available. So what about the governance of the public AI seen as a utility to cope between the need for agility and the necessity of finding consensus among the institutions or the nations that are contributing resources? So I think the question is how to avoid swapping a problem with another, like tackling the private influence, or the risk of negative private influence with the problem of bureaucracy and finding alignment that might slow down things.
Absolutely. So just on the multilateral front, I think what we've found is that it's actually much better to work, in this case, with national governments than, in this case, the European Union or some of these regional efforts, just because national governments are set up to move much, much faster. So you can avoid a lot of bureaucracy if you can sort of move directly with these national governments. On the governance question, on the sort of like specific angle around the utility, I think the fact that I'm calling it utility paints a picture of like what I think the governance could or should look like, right? Because a public utility is there are different versions of this, but it's often a private company that can move fast and take investment and sort of like just lay down some cables and things like that. But it's regulated by usually like a national utility commission, right? That says like, this is how much profit you can possibly make. This is the standard of service you need to have. And it's necessary because often these utilities are effectively monopolies or near monopolies in the regions that they serve, right? There's like one gas utility that like provides services in this area. And these are very, very large companies oftentimes, right? And they can make a lot of money. And it's important that you regulate them so that they don't extract everything else and then, suppress innovation. To me, that's like one version of this. I've also come to realize in working with a lot of different countries that it really looks different in every different country. So like in Singapore, right? Maybe Joseph can speak to this later. It's very likely that it might actually just be a government thing because the Singaporean government is just very, very strong and active and moves quite fast. So they have the capacity to do this. Similarly in Sweden, for maybe different reasons, there's just a lot of public trust in public institutions there. They have a lot of, just publicly owned utilities. In the UK, it might actually just be something like the BBC, right? It might be entirely government funded. So I think there's different variations of this that can work in different countries, and it kind of comes down to the politics and the history in those countries, how governance should work. But I think that's the key thing for me, is that it's not, the decision doesn't come from San Francisco somewhere. It comes from each country kind of figuring out for itself, this is what makes sense for our people and our government and our politics and our history.
All right. Thank you. I would leave the word to Joost.
Yeah, Josh. So many thanks for your presentation. I would have a couple of questions. We can see how many questions are from the general audience. One question I have is, we can talk about Apertus as, the Swiss model, but we like to talk about it as, a model made in Switzerland for the world. And so how could you see that we, get people around an effort like Apertus, and maybe for, a next release that, is somehow planned to become more like a global resource? So, that it doesn't get too much the Swiss stamp, but really kind of, a model for the public good. Now, how can we approach that?
So glad you asked. So actually, I think this is really interesting. And I think like Apertus, where I would say like an Apertus style strategy, is something I would love to pursue, if this Airbus for AI thing is able to take off, as it were. Because I think what Apertus does is it's taken a very, we've talked about transparency, and obviously that's very important. It's actually really open source. But I think what's drawn a lot of people's attention is that it's taken it's perhaps the world's first really like sizable, competitive, no theft model, right? In the sense that Swiss AI has taken a huge amount of effort to really respect copyright across the web. There's still like things here and there, but clearly, it's addressable. It's just a difference in tone and approach that, could perhaps serve as the foundation for a more Spotify style approach to AI, right? Like we all know that the frontier labs have effectively trained on stolen data. If we're not stealing, maybe we can sort of work out collaborations or partnerships with many of the copyright holders and producers, large media companies. I don't think I can say their names yet, but we're actually working with some right now to sort of say, hey, maybe this is one you can use. I think I've also seen a lot of interest from the, let's say, the nonprofit sector in Apertus. So folks who are, building agentic workflows for farmers in rural Africa, rural Rwanda, elements of the Gates Foundation, the elements, different chapters of the Red Cross. There's a sense that's like, this is kind of like the the vegetarian or the vegan option compared to the slightly more predatory commercial options, private options that exist out there, and that for those who are very values aligned, purchase kind of speaks to that, and they kind of really like it.
Cool. We have a question from our colleague Prashant. We'll read it aloud. So if a public AI utility gets, say, 80% usage rate in Europe, how much would that require? Would that require data center infrastructure cost? And at that point, would the success of this project be bound by accessing to cutting edge chips?
This is a really good question. And it's not a question I have asked myself or have a off the cuff answer, because it would be incredibly awesome if we managed to get 80% across Europe. And I'm not at that level yet. I'm not thinking at that level yet. Joseph, I don't know, you've been thinking a lot about inference economics lately. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, sure. Hey all. I think it's important to differentiate, like distinguish between the costs required to train a model and the cost required to serve inference for a model. So the way we consume AI right now means that right at the moment, all AI companies do both of these together. Which kind of means that which could potentially mean that our inference is actually being subsidized, or we are like maybe earning more value from like one part of it, and that value is being funneled to another part of it. But it's actually very possible for us to separate between like who does the training and who does the serving. So yeah, something we are working on is actually there's a lot of promising research and work in this area. For example, we don't need GPUs for inference. Maybe we could just run it on CPU, especially for smaller models. That's something that's happening. People are working on distributed inference, running like 8 different Mac Minis in a server rack and just distributing the load of a 70B model across consumer grade hardware. So I think very much on the inference side, the cost is going to go down, and that will involve like different politics. It's a whole different game than the big data centers, the gigafactories that we're all building for training foundational models.
Maybe I can try to put in my thoughts there as well. So I think there was a recent graph from Epoch AI that showed the cost of R&D and inference for OpenAI. They can of course not really know that, but there the inference cost was $2 billion per year. And so if we say, okay, we go with 80% of that, because it's all probably we're talking about a cost of about $2 billion per year. I think that would be my answer to Prashant. And then if you want to estimate the cost in GPUs or the number of GPUs, you divide that, I don't know, by $10,000 per GPU, and then you can estimate how many GPUs that would be, and it probably would be beyond, what indeed a non-tier 0 or 1 from the US would be able to get. So I think it's quite large, but it's also not truly astronomical.
Yeah, I personally think it's both not astronomical. There's already kind of relatively large commitments across Europe to like fund this infrastructure, so it will exist effectively, right? To handle it. This last thing is, I would say, like, because of the hopefully improving kind of innovations in sort of distributed sort of inference, that I don't think we're actually ever going to be really sort of bound by access to like this number of Blackwells, right? I think there's a lot of ways we can get reasonable inference without being bound by these specific chip bottlenecks.
Okay, I see no other questions in our chat from the panelists. Joost, I see you raising your
If there's no further questions, I'm going to use the opportunity. Joseph, I guess, has been working closely together with some of the engineers at CSCS to get the endpoint working. So my question would be kind of how was that experience, and what else would be really valuable for you from like a technical point of view? What would make CSCS an interesting technical partner for this kind of endeavor?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think it's been great working with CSCS because we've kind of are working with two different flavors of compute providers, right? Some of them give us raw bare metal compute, which means I just get access to a server, I SSH in, and I spin it up myself. But yeah, CSCS has been great because yeah, you guys have helped us to actually run and spin up and manage the infrastructure for that. And also we've been talking about, how do we support two use on the apparatus model? And we've like done some editing to configuration, things like that. So yeah, that's been awesome. How can we be a better partner? Yeah, I guess just it's not so much about like things we got to do like now or things we got to check box. What we are really hoping to do with all of this is create stability, and like how do we sustain this is the more important question for us. So yeah, and that's we want that's something like we'll love to like figure out together.
Yep. Great, thank you.
Okay, again, I don't see other questions. I could go next, although it's not related to the previous one. And so I think this stems from something that I picked up in the same presentation or similar presentation in San Jose. And it goes along the deja vu of what we have seen in some countries more than elsewhere, where the social media platform achieved a situation where by the time the governments understood the risks, it was a bit too late for them to handle it. And then there were some problems tied to mass disinformation and similar. And I think I see the potential for public AI to be, I don't know if it's intentional or is not, but to be an alternative that the governments might be interested to foster, like they do, for example, with public TV broadcasters in some nations. And how is then the public AI initiative motives, the idea of the initiative as a whole linked to those situations that we have seen related to social media platforms?
Thanks for this great question, Stefano. I don't know how much I can reveal. Okay, let me just say that we have been in conversations with a couple of public media broadcasters. Can I just say, yeah, including the BBC. Precisely, like partly it's there's a lot of different motivations that go into these conversations, but one of the precise hopes is that you can sort of take the kind of the trust and neutrality and the trust that a lot of these public broadcasters have managed to achieve and translate that into AI, right? Ideally with the help directly of those public broadcasters. I think that's exactly one of our hopes, right? That there will be kind of a public service option for AI in the same way that almost every country has a kind of like public media option, and that people can choose to get their news and entertainment and facts and I don't know, like cat recommendations from that instead of that only like being the private option being the only option. And I think there are a lot of good things about that. And it's how do I say it? it's something that resonates not just with users in these different countries. It's something that resonates with a lot of people in public service as well.
I see. Yeah. Thank you. And with this, I notice we are close to the hour, so we could start to wrap up. Hold on. Before we wrap up, I see just an additional question came in from our colleague Thomas. And thanks for the presentation. I wonder how do the prospects for a sovereign public AI get affected by the history of attempts for public internet infrastructure or former initiatives to build public clouds back in the early cloud computing revolution days? You will see the question now.
Yeah, I think this is a very fair question. And this is, talking about initiatives like the European Cloud Initiative, Gaia X, what is it, IPCEI, right? None of which work particularly well, right? I think particularly like people really, love criticizing Gaia X. So why will this be any different, right? Why would this particular public infrastructure, attempt, this multilateral industrial policy thing, work when these efforts didn't work? I'm going to give a probably not very politically correct answer to this, which is partly this would work because it's not coming from the European Union. And it's not because the European Union isn't, in many ways, a great institution that does a lot of good things. But I think it's also clear that it's not really good at doing kind of this multilateral industrial policy. And that Airbus did work partly because literally, the European Union didn't exist back then, or certainly not in the same form, right? The key thing here is that public infrastructure and these kind of multilateral infrastructure projects can work. Clearly, we know that public media works, right? The BBC is one of the most respected brands across the entire world. But there needs to be a clear business strategy that gets attached to that. And there needs to be a way in which you protect these entities from basically politics, right? There's all sorts of ways in which politics can interfere with just hard decisions, business decisions that need to be made. And if you're constantly, negotiating with other countries, like between this group of countries about like how does this work, and where is this piece of factory going to be, and where these jobs are, ultimately that makes you not very competitive with the leading, with the existing private companies, especially when they're very, very well capitalized companies coming from the US. Right?
Okay. Guys, there is one last question. We are now over time, and I wonder if you could spend just a few seconds answering it. So again, it's from our colleague Prashant. So closely related to the pre-AI era, open source and public utility proponents haven't been able to create momentum for publicly owned search engines and social media platforms of that kind. Do you feel optimistic about convincing today governments and politicians about AI as a public utility, given the power of big corporations?
Also a really good question. And I know it's over time, so I'll try to answer this quickly. The best way I can convey why this time is different is if you look at all these different situations, let's say like search engines or social media versus AI, or even airplanes. Think about like the way we analogize. We talk about AI. People like to talk about it compared to nuclear energy. I'm talking about it compared to airplanes. These are all like really critical, what we think of as like dual use technologies, and it's very obviously dual use, right? And you can see this in the way that politicians react to these efforts now. There's huge amounts of sovereign AI investment into AI in the way that there wasn't and there was never going to be that level of investment into like public search engine, right? It's just like you couldn't convince the politicians to care enough. That is extreme. That is like so clearly different in AI. The urgency is much greater. And I think this speaks to like, if you can create that level of urgency, you can create that political buy-in from the very top, that unlocks the level of capital and the urgency to sort of say, okay, I'm going to create this, this organization, this entity, whether public or private or some mix of the two, to create that this public option, right? So I think once again, it's just saying we have seen successful cases where really wonderful public institutions and public utilities were created. They had to happen within particular circumstances. There needed to be that particular set of political and economic factors. I think those things exist for AI in a way that did not exist for search or for social media.
Right. Okay, then from me, thank you very much, Joshua and Joseph, for joining us today with this presentation and these discussions. And also thank you for all the work we have been doing together over the past months. And yeah, looking forward to that continuation and to meet again at some point.
Of course. Thank you so much for having us and for this continued collaboration. Thanks for having us.